And just while we talk about what is a project and project management accountabilities, I just want to briefly talk about stakeholders. Who are the key stakeholders within the project? And that can vary depending on the workplace and the nature of what you do and so forth. However, generally speaking, we can categorize our stakeholders and name them up as these key stakeholders: the client or the owner, and that is usually the person whom the endeavor or the enterprise belongs to. So the organization whose strategic plan created the need for the project, or the person who requires a project to be undertaken. So sometimes this can be the same person as the next one I'm going to describe, who is the sponsor. Sometimes not. So if in the government context, the client or owner could be the department or agency. It could be the secretary. It could be the FAS. It can be a number of people who represent the organization. And that may or may not be the same as the sponsor. And the sponsor is the person who is providing the funds and has ultimate authority over the project. So when I say may or may not, because sometimes it may be that your manager, as the branch manager, might be the sponsor because they own the responsibility for the project. However, the branch manager may not necessarily be the client. That might be the divisional manager who actually owns the initiative because it's part of their strategic imperative or something like that. So sometimes they can be both and sometimes not. If I take it outside of the government context, so for example in the private sector, I could be, for example, the project manager for an electrical company. And so I work for an electrical company, and my boss, who may be the owner of the business, has given me this job to do, which is a huge electrical job. So I'm undertaking it as a project manager. So my boss becomes the sponsor. However, the client could be the person who owns the building or the site in which I'm doing my electrical work. So let's just say it's a construction of a new set of apartments, and it's by ABC Construction is building those. They'll be the client, the owner. The boss of my company will be the sponsor because they're the ones who have been given the job from the construction company, and they're handing it to me as a project manager. So that you can have different variations of the relationships between those three. Most commonly, for us, if we're working in the government sector, for example, it is not uncommon for the sponsor and the client owner to be together. But the most important relationship for us as the project manager is really the sponsor. The sponsor gives us the task. They're the ones that say to us, and in this context, they'll give us the project scope and say, Tony, you need to deliver this by this particular time and under this particular budget and to these quality standards. And then when I've done my job, I hand it back to the sponsor. So at the end of the project, eventually I'll go, okay, here you go, sponsor. Here's the project back. So that's most commonly my manager. Here's the project back. I've done up to whatever has been asked of me to do with that. And now I'm going off to do my other task or my other things that I'm supposed to be doing. If I'm a project manager, I'll go off to my next project. And then I hand the project I've just worked on, I hand that back to my sponsor. We also have end users, and they're the people who will be using the final product or service that we're delivering. Project managers ourselves, as I just described in the previous slide. We've got project team members, I should say, who are the people who will report to us in terms of accountability through the project. And they're the people who generally are performing the work, the frontline work. They're the individuals who will be executing the tasks and actions and so forth. And then we have other, I'm just lumping all these together, other project stakeholders such as contractors, suppliers, maybe other departments or agencies. And that could be, there can also be internal departments. So I may be working in the IT section, for example, and part of the project is liaising with the procurement team and and the legal team and so forth. So we may have other stakeholders across the organisation in that regard as well. And each of our stakeholders will have a different level of priority within the project. And what do I mean by that? Well, some people, some of the stakeholders, some people involved in this project will, as the project manager, will have a lot of our attention. Others may not have as much. And how do we determine this other than the informal people we like and people we don't like? There are more formal, structured and more objective processes of doing that. And one of those is using the priority matrix or the power interest grid that's on this slide. And that is thinking about each of your stakeholders, each of those stakeholder segments. So, such as, for example, different management within the organization or different suppliers or end users. It could be members of the public or different segmentations of members of the public and so forth. And thinking about where they fit within their level of interest in the project and their level of influence or power within the project. So power, we talk about and that can be both formal and informal power. So formal power can be their ability to make decisions or create change through their formal authority. So if we think about our manager has a high degree of power. Their manager has an even higher degree of power, and so forth. Because by their formal authority, they have the ability to influence decision making or influence the direction of what we're doing. But we can also have informal power. So there are other power levers that people can use, such as referent power, where just by being popular amongst the team, for example, in the project team, you might have one or two project team members who are quite popular, quite experienced, and quite influential amongst that team on an informal, an informal level, and they may have some consideration around power levels in that. So you might think about their influence with other team members and so forth. So traditionally we think about this matrix, and when we think about the power axis, we're thinking about in terms of formal power, but you can also take into consideration informal. But the other axis is the interest axis. What level of interest do they have? So some of our stakeholders will have a high level of interest. So, for example, you have members of the public, whatever project we're working on is outward facing, it has an impact to the general public. They may have a really high level of interest in what's going on because it will impact them, whatever we do, but they may have a very low level of power because they're outside the organization and they don't really have either formal or informal power levers to influence decisions or what we're doing. So that's going to be different to someone, say, our manager, who has a high level of influence, so high level power, and may also have a really high level of interest because ultimately they're accountable for the project. So in that case, the way that we manage our manager might be very different to the way that we manage a member of the public. So we think about those two characteristics of the individual, of the stakeholder. We think about their level of interest and we think about their level of influence. And taking those two into consideration, we think about the way that we should respond to that. And the matrix, this power interest grid on this slide, is a really good guide for us. So we can use that to say if someone has high level of influence or power and they have a high level of interest, then we should manage those people closely. We should consult with them highly, make sure that we get their input, their voice permeates what we're doing, and also making sure that we let them know what's going on so that the flow of information back and forth is always on song, so that we've got them closely connected and they've got their finger on the pulse. However, if if our manager is also a stakeholder in the project, say they represent the owner, then they have a high level of power, but their level of interest might be low because it's not their direct accountability, it's our manager's direct accountability. So from their perspective, their level of interest might be quite low. So in that case, it's just really about finding out what their needs are and making sure that we keep them satisfied. Making sure that we keep our finger on the pulse in terms of what their needs are, and then just making sure that we deliver to those needs. However, if we've got someone a stakeholder who has a low level of power or influence, such as that member of the public example I gave earlier, however, they're really highly interested because the final outcome is going to have an impact on them, then we should keep them informed. There's no real need to consult. There's no real need to have their voice permeate what we're going to do, although that will depend in terms of where they sit within the power grid, in the power axis. However, we should, at this level where they're a low power and high interest, we should keep them informed, always letting them know what we're doing, the key things that are going to have an impact on them. However, if we've got stakeholders who have low power and low interest, so that's maybe other members of the public who don't really have an influence into the decision-making process and don't have a high level of interest because the outcome isn't going to impact them anyway. However, by the nature of what it is that we're doing, we do have them as a stakeholder. Well, then it might just be a minimal effort thing, a monitor, making sure that we keep an eye on them and making sure that that their level of power interest doesn't shift throughout the life of the project. And that's the key to my next point, which is that these things aren't static. You're always reevaluating where your stakeholders sit within this grid. So, for example, my manager's manager whose interest was really low, high power interest was really low at the start of the project. It may be that something quite significant has happened during the life of the project. Let's say, for example, it's one of the talking points in the media, and then all of a sudden they become really quite interested in it. They shift from keep satisfied to manage closely. All of a sudden our consultation and communication strategy needs to reflect that shift. So we start to think more about involving them in the consultation process and making sure that we keep them more closely into the link when we're keeping the information flowing out.